The Census Taker. Paul adjusted his tie for the fourth time, the fabric suddenly feeling too tight around his neck. He stared into the streaked bathroom mirror of the budget motel, his reflection pale and tired under the flickering fluorescent light. The bureau didn't pay enough for comfort, but the job wasn't about luxury. It was about diligence, precision, and persistence. All qualities Paul told himself he had in spades. His next assignment was Stillbourne, a town he'd never heard of before it showed up in his briefing packet. A dot on the map surrounded by unbroken swaths of wilderness. The details were sparse, low population, rural. Likely another dying town holding on to nothing but memories. Paul folded the map, tucking it into the glove box of his car, and set off as the early morning sun climbed.
In and out,
he muttered to himself, tapping the steering wheel to the beat of an old country song.
Just another ghost town.
As he drove, the hum of the engine filled the silence. His eyes flicked to the photograph wedged into the visor. His daughter, Lily, smiling in a pink sundress, her gap-toothed grin framed by golden curls. The photo had been taken years ago, back when he still had weekends with her. Paul's stomach twisted. He'd promised himself this would be the last assignment before taking the time to fight for more custody. But the bureau kept sending him out, and he kept saying yes, avoiding the messy confrontation of courtrooms and lawyers.
Just one more,
he whispered to himself.
One more, and I'll fix everything.
But as the silence of Stillbourne settled around him, a darker thought crept in. What if he couldn't fix anything? What if Lily already thought of him as nothing more than a name on an occasional birthday card? The photograph weighed on him. She'd been 6 when that picture was taken, spinning in circles in the park until she fell into his arms, giggling. That was the kind of moment he used to live for. But now, he'd missed so much. Her first recital, the field trip to the zoo, and last Christmas, all excuses he couldn't take back. Stillbourne was a strange kind of beautiful, the kind that felt preserved, like an old photograph you couldn't bring yourself to throw away. Every house was immaculately maintained, porches swept clean, hedges trimmed to geometric precision. Flowers in bloom spilled from neatly arranged window boxes. But something was wrong. Paul parked near the center of town, stepping out into silence so profound it rang in his ears. No cars passed by. No dogs barked. Even the wind seemed muted, carrying only the faint scent of flowers and something metallic. He pulled out his clipboard and checked the first address on his list. A 2-story home with pale blue shutters stood at the edge of the square. Paul knocked 3 times, the sound sharp and jarring in the stillness. No answer. He opened the door cautiously, calling out as he entered.
Hello, Census Bureau. Just here to drop off some paperwork.
Inside, the house was pristine. The faint scent of lavender lingered, but the air felt heavy, almost oppressive. Paul set a form on the table, name of head of household, number of residents, occupation. He glanced around once more before leaving. For a moment, his reflection in the mirror above the mantel caught his eye, but he didn't linger. By midday, Paul had visited every house in Stillbourne. Each one was the same, spotless, perfectly arranged, but empty. There were no signs of life, not even the faintest suggestion that anyone had recently walked these floors or touched the perfectly set tables. The town was a lifeless museum, every house a diorama. Paul left surveys on tables, counters, and desks, the growing stack of blank forms in his satchel shrinking steadily. He worked methodically, his pen scratching against the still air. The routine steadied him, kept his thoughts from wandering too far. But when he returned to the first house to collect the initial survey, he froze in the doorway. The form was filled out. Name of head of household, unknown. Number of residents, none. Occupation, observer. He frowned. The handwriting was identical to his own. Paul stared at the form, his breath shallow. The handwriting was unmistakable, his, but that was impossible. He hadn't filled this out. His mind reeled as he backed out of the house, the weight of the clipboard pressing against his chest like a leaden stone.
Someone's playing a trick,
he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow. He left the house quickly, his heart pounding in his chest, a cold sweat slicking his back. He told himself it didn't matter. It couldn't matter. But the next house brought more of the same. Every form he retrieved bore answers in his handwriting, cryptic responses that sent chills crawling up his spine. Number of residents, just me. What is your age? The same as yours. Occupation? Census Bureau agent. Paul's pulse quickened with each response, the weight of the clipboard in his hand growing unbearable. He began scanning the rooms more carefully, convinced now that someone was watching him, waiting for him to falter. Shadows flickered just beyond his vision, darting too quickly to catch, but lingering long enough to send icy dread trickling down his spine. He whipped his head around at the faint sound of footsteps echoing behind him, but there was no one there. Only the empty hallways and the suffocating silence of Stillbourne. Curtains swayed as though someone had brushed past them moments before, though the air was perfectly still. A chair that had been tucked neatly under the dining table earlier now stood slightly ajar, as if it had been pulled out for someone unseen. His throat was dry as he stepped outside, gulping in the cold air. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch unnaturally toward him. His thoughts turned again to Lily. Was she better off without him? He pictured her calling someone else Dad, a man who didn't leave, who didn't miss birthdays or recitals. A lump rose in his throat. Was that why he kept saying just one more, to avoid knowing he wasn't enough? Shaking off the thought, Paul turned toward the next house, each step heavier than the last. As dusk fell, he discovered a trapdoor beneath the threadbare rug in one of the houses. The wood groaned as he pulled it open, revealing a dark, narrow staircase leading into the earth below. The basement walls were lined with shelves, each one sagging under the weight of stacks of census forms. Paul's stomach lurched as he stepped closer, picking up a fragile sheet at random. The ink had faded, the paper yellowed with age, but the handwriting, it was his. One form after another, decade after decade, all written in his unmistakable hand. His flashlight swept across the shelves, illuminating hundreds, no, thousands of forms, each one bearing answers in his writing. Paul's breath came in shallow gasps as his light landed on the far wall, where a large, tattered sheet of paper hung pinned by rusted nails. Scrawled across it was a list of names. Each name was crossed out with a thick black line. Paul's flashlight trembled as his gaze fell to the bottom of the list. His legs nearly gave out when he saw it. Paul Chambers. The ink was fresh.
You already know.
A voice rasped behind him. Paul spun, his flashlight jerking wildly across the room. The beam caught a figure leaning against the far wall. The man's face was hollow, his uniform hanging in shredded strips as if it had rotted away with him.
I was you, once, just like all the others before us.
Paul's breath hitched.
What others? What do you mean?
You think you're counting the town.
The man said, his voice low and ragged.
But the town is counting. You.
The words cut through Paul like ice. His pulse thundered in his ears, and he stumbled back a step, his flashlight shaking.
You're talking nonsense. This isn't real.
The man's eyes, empty, endless voids, locked onto Paul.
It's as real as you make it. Every form you fill out, every question you answer, every tally mark, it binds you. It gives the town its form, its life. And once you've started, there's no leaving.
Paul's knees felt weak, but he forced himself to stand his ground.
This is insane. I'm not part of this. I'll leave. I'll drive until...
Until what?
The man cut him off, stepping closer.
Until you circle back here? Until the roads twist and turn you around like they did to me? Stillbourne isn't a place you visit. It's a place that visits you.
Paul's heart hammered in his chest. He shook his head, gripping the flashlight like a lifeline.
I can't. I won't.
The man leaned in, his grin widening into something unnatural, his voice a venomous hiss.
Do you even remember the last town you visited, or the one before that? Were they even real? Or were you already here, filling out forms, thinking you were just passing through?
Paul staggered back, tripping over a pile of discarded papers. He scrambled to his feet as the man's voice grew louder, filling the room like a chorus of echoes.
We all thought we were just passing through,
the man said, his tone dropping to a mournful whisper.
But none of us ever left.
Paul's flashlight flickered and died. The last thing he saw was the man's outstretched hand, pointing toward him as if passing judgment. In the suffocating dark, Paul's breaths came fast and shallow. Somewhere behind him, he heard the faint, unmistakable sound of a pen scratching against paper. His legs burned as he climbed the basement stairs, his flashlight long forgotten in the darkness below. The papers, the man, his words, it all swirled in his mind like a storm. He burst out into the cool night air, gasping, the stillness of Stillbourne pressing against him like a shroud. He stumbled to his car, fumbling with the keys until they fell from his shaking hands. Paul cursed under his breath, dropping to his knees to snatch them off the ground. When the car door finally unlocked, he threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. The cabin felt suffocatingly small, the air thick with his own panicked breaths. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The engine roared to life, and Paul sped down the main road, tires squealing. He didn't care about the map, about directions, he only wanted to leave. But as the town disappeared in his rearview mirror, the road ahead grew eerily familiar. White houses with pristine sidewalks blurred past. A mailbox the same as before. A faded billboard advertising a decades-old festival. Paul turned left, then right, and then left again, but each corner only brought him back to the same town square. His breath came in shallow gasps as dread clawed at his chest.
No.
He slammed the brakes, the car skidding to a stop. The streetlights above flickered as if mocking his panic. He glanced out the windshield and froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road, illuminated by the headlights. It held a clipboard, its form too familiar, its stance too steady. Paul's stomach churned as the figure stepped closer. It was him. No, not exactly him. This Paul was older, gaunt, his features hollowed by time and something worse. His eyes, empty pits, stared back at him. The clipboard in his hands was weathered, the pages yellowed, but Paul recognized his own handwriting scrawled across it.
No,
Paul whispered, his voice shaking.
This isn't real.
The other Paul tilted his head slightly, like a predator studying its prey. Then, with deliberate precision, he raised a hand in a silent wave. Paul screamed and threw the car into reverse, the engine roaring as he sped backward. The tires screeched and the car jolted to a stop as it struck something solid. His head snapped backward, pain lancing through his skull as it collided with the headrest. Dazed, Paul stumbled out of the car, clutching his throbbing forehead. The air felt heavier, the silence more oppressive than before. He turned, expecting to see the figure again, but the street was empty. Only faint footsteps, burned into the asphalt like scorched shadows, led away into the darkness. The town square loomed ahead, unchanged, as though it had been waiting for him. Weeks later, a new census taker arrived in Stillbourne. His car rolled to a stop in the deserted town square, the engine's hum fading into the oppressive silence. He stepped out slowly, scanning the empty streets with the clipboard clutched tightly in his hand. The air was heavy, laced with the faint scent of lavender and something metallic that he couldn't place. The town felt wrong, though he couldn't quite say why. The houses were pristine, their white siding gleaming in the afternoon sun. Flowers bloomed in tidy beds, the only hint of life in the otherwise still scene. Yet the silence pressed down on him, as though the place were holding its breath. Inside one of the houses, Paul stood in the shadows, watching. His clothes hung loose on his frame, his face pale and hollow. He reached out toward the window, his fingers trembling. He wanted to scream, to wave, to do anything to warn the newcomer, but no sound came. His throat burned with the effort, yet only silence escaped. The town had taken his voice, just as it had taken everything else. As the new arrival stepped closer to the first house, Paul's shadow shifted, flickering unnaturally across the walls. He could feel it now, the pull, the town's hunger wrapping tighter around him, forcing him deeper into its grasp. A scratching sound rose on the wind, faint but insistent, like the drag of a pen on paper. It echoed through the empty streets, growing louder with each step the census taker took. He paused, his head tilting as if he'd heard something, but he shook it off and continued. Paul's chest tightened. He tried once more to scream, his mouth opening wide, but the sound was ripped away before it could form. Instead, the scratching grew louder, now joined by the faint creak of floorboards and distant whispers. The newcomer approached the house where Paul waited, clipboard in hand, oblivious to the watching shadows. Paul sank deeper into the darkness, his eyes wide and pleading. The whispers in the air weren't words anymore, just the ceaseless scratching, relentless and mocking, as if the town were already writing the census taker's fate. And outside, the wind howled, carrying a haunting cry of endless census forms, rustling like leaves, each name etched in anguish, counted and condemned to Stillbourne's ledger for eternity.
Just one more.
Paul's voice cracked, a silent promise to Lily that he would be there next time. The light in the budget motel room flickered weakly, the same tired bulb that had illuminated Paul's reflection hours earlier. Now the room was heavy with the scent of antiseptic and sorrow. The coroner knelt by the bathroom door, finishing the somber task of taking down the body from the noose tied to the shower rod. He zipped the black body bag shut and stood, wiping his gloves clean as he turned to the detective standing nearby.
There was a wallet in his back pocket, not much in it.
The detective nodded, flipping through the leather wallet with a practiced efficiency. He pulled out the ID and glanced at it.
Paul Chambers,
he murmured. The coroner tilted his head toward the photograph still nestled inside the wallet.
There's an old photo in there. Little girl in a sundress. You think it's his daughter?
The detective studied the picture for a long moment.
maybe. Looks like she was important to him.
Neither of them said anything more as the coroner hefted the bag onto the gurney and wheeled it out. The room was left empty again, silent apart from the faint hum of the flickering light. Paul's promises to Lily were simple. Just one more assignment, one more town, and then he'd finally make things right. But some promises are bound to break, especially when they're made to escape the truth. Stillbourne wasn't just another dot on the map. It was a purgatory for a man who tried to leave his guilt behind, only to be counted among its ledger of lost souls. What would Stillbourne uncover about you? If this chilling tale left you uneasy, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the Haunt Vault for more unsettling stories that linger long after the lights go out. Until next time, stay curious and stay haunted.